broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Campbell, and I am the Assistant Director for the National Adult Protective Services Association, and I'm happy to welcome you all to today's webinar, so thank you so much for being here. Before introducing the topic and speakers, I would like to provide some information related to the technology that we're using for today's webinar. All attendees are muted throughout the presentation, but there is a questions box in that control panel that should have popped up to the right of your screen when you logged on to the webinar. You can use that questions box and write in any comments or concerns and content-related questions that you have throughout. If you have a tech-related question, feel free to write that in there as well, and I will try to help you out with that. We are recording today's webinar, and I will be posting that recording to NAPSA's website, and that will be announced. Additionally, a PDF of today's slides are uploaded in the handout section of that control panel on the right side of your screen. And we do have a few poll questions today, so keep a lookout for those. So today we have two presenters with us to present NAPSA Meet the North American Securities Administrators Association, so NASAA. First, we have Deborah Gillis, who is the chair of NASAA's Senior Issues and Diminished Capacity Committee. She is Senior Legal Counsel with the Financial and Consumer Services Commission of New Brunswick, Canada. And we also have Kristen Standifer, who is Vice Chair of the NASAA Senior Issues and Diminished Capacity Committee. And she is the Licensing and Examination Supervisor for the Washington State Securities Division. So thank you so much, Deborah and Kristen, for being here with us today. And without further delay, I will hand it off to you.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon, I'm Deborah Gillis, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today, NAPSA Meet NASA. We want to thank NAPSA for this opportunity to present to its members, and really we see it as an excellent opportunity to continue to forge a special relationship with NAPSA members in our common fight against financial exploitation of older and vulnerable adults. What many of you may not realize on the line was that this is kind of like a two-part series where we had NAPSA come and present to NASAA yesterday. And so it was really great to hear more about NAPSA yesterday through Lori Delagramaticas and Joe Snyder, who both presented to us. We really learned a lot about NAPSA, and I know that I'm really looking forward to future upcoming events that you're putting off, like the Summit for Elder Financial Exploitation in November. Before we get started today, we're just going to give you a little bit more detail, I guess, on my background and Kristen's background. So I'm a senior legal counsel, as Karen said, and I work in the securities regulator in New Brunswick, Canada. So that would be the province right above Maine. So you'll probably notice if I give some examples today, they might be Maine related because I often hear about examples from there. So in the past number of years, my focus has really been on older and vulnerable investors and consumers. And as a regulator in New Brunswick, we don't just regulate securities, we actually do regulate a whole host of other consumer areas, such as insurance, mortgage brokers, and real estate agents, which is why my work has focused perhaps a little more broadly on consumers and investors. Through working with the security side of things, I've really been fortunate to work with my colleague, Kristen, and other knowledgeable colleagues on the NASAA Senior Issues and Diminished Capacity Committee, as a member and then as vice chair and currently as the chair. I've also had an opportunity to chair a national effort in Canada through the Canadian Securities Administrators to amend our securities regulatory framework to help better protect senior investors. And this framework is currently actually out for consultation. So Kristen, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Deb. You can see my biography on the slide there, but I just wanted to add that I found my passion for helping to protect seniors from financial exploitation when I was an assistant attorney general representing Washington State's APS program. I came to know several social workers well and found them to be extremely hardworking. Some of them are strong allies today as I continue the fight in this new way. And I hope that after today, you feel that you can reach out to myself and to Deb to discuss issues that we raise in this presentation or other issues related to the topic, because truly when we work together, we are stronger. Next slide, please.
So in the webinar today, we plan to tell you about the NASA organization and the role of state securities regulators. So really that you can appreciate what we do day to day and really to see how we may interact with older and vulnerable adults and how we play an important part in protecting older and vulnerable investors from financial exploitation through both the NASA organization and through the state securities regulators. We're going to talk about our NASA Senior Investor Protection Initiative that we launched in 2014 with the addition of our Senior and Vulnerable Investor Committee and the Advisory Council, which advises this committee. And we'll discuss the NASA Model Act to protect vulnerable adults from financial exploitation that our committee drafted and then that our membership adopted in 2016, and which states have been adopting in whole or in part since then. We're then going to walk through our engagement efforts with other groups, so who also might be seeking to protect older investors, and tell you more about how those engagement efforts have really helped our NASA Senior Investor Protection initiatives that we've undertaken since the Model Act was in place. And lastly, and possibly most importantly for the audience today, will be our commentary throughout on how we as state securities regulators can be an important resource for adult protective services agencies, and how we would most commonly interact with APS agencies in the pursuit of stopping and preventing financial exploitation. So I'm going to move to a poll, and to give Kristen and I a better understanding of your understanding of our organization, we'd like to poll the audience with these two poll questions. So have you heard of NASA before, yes or no? And have you worked with your state securities regulator before? So Karen's going to help us with the poll here.
Yeah, so I will launch this first question. Have you heard of NASAA before? So you can go ahead and respond, vote on this question by just clicking the little empty dot next to the yes or no option. And I'll leave this open for probably about another 30 seconds. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that first poll and then share the results with folks. So it looks like 34% said yes and 66% said no. All right, and now I will launch the second question, which is, have you worked with your state securities regulator before? So again, you should see that pop up on your screen, and you should be able to click yes or no to cast your vote. All right, I'm going to close this poll and then share the results. So 26% say yes and 74% no.
Okay, so great. So I feel like we have a little bit of work to do then. It seems like some people have heard of NASA before, so about 34% have and 66% haven't. And so just to be clear, for those of you who have heard of NASA before, we're not talking about the space NASA here. So I have a stepson who may have misled some of his little buddies. I was telling Kristen this story yesterday. We are a volunteer organization, and yearly for volunteering for NASA, we often get these little gifts in the mail. So you might get a water bottle, or you might get like a little book, a notepad or something, and it normally has the NASA logo on it. Well, I couldn't understand why year after year he'd been asking me for these little gifts that came in the mail. And I realized when I asked him, I said, like, what are you asking for these for? What would you want these for? And he said, well, I'm telling my friends that they're from NASA. And I said, but they're not, you know that, right? He said, oh yeah, I know that, but they don't know. Anyway, so just to be clear, not the space organization. I think it's great that about 26% have worked with state agencies, state securities regulators before, but we really think that a holistic approach to financial exploitation is a better approach. And so we'd like to see more of our state securities regulators reaching out to APS and vice versa. And so hopefully this webinar today will help to foster that relationship and tell you a little bit more about what we do, so you'll be more eager to reach out to us. So on to the next slide. So NASAA. NASAA stands for the North American Securities Administrators Association. And NASAA was actually organized over 100 years ago, back in 1919, and it's considered the oldest international organization devoted to investor protection. It's a voluntary association, as I said earlier, and it's made up of representatives from regulators in all states, in DC, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Canada, and Mexico. And so state and provincial securities regulators have really been important to the protection of investors. And in fact, state and provincial efforts to protect investors precedes federal efforts by about 20 years, and the creation of the SEC by about 20 years. So provincial and state efforts got their beginnings in about 1911 and 1912, and the SEC wasn't created until about 20 years later. At NASAA, our vision is to protect investors from fraud and abuse, educate investors, and support responsible capital formation, really to help ensure the integrity and efficiency of financial markets. And our mission is to represent and serve our members, who would be securities administrators, through education, cooperation, coordination, communication, subject matter expertise, and advocacy. Again, I said before, it's made up of state and provincial representatives from securities regulators who volunteer to be a part of this association. So state securities regulators really also serve a vital role in protecting investors, especially those who lack expertise, and particularly older and vulnerable investors. So how do we do this? And if we could move to the next slide. We do this by focusing on 5 key areas that I have listed here on the slide. So we do this through licensing and examining. So in terms of licensing, state securities regulators would license stockbrokers, investment advisor firms that manage less than 100 million in assets, and securities firms that conduct business in the state. State securities regulators would also register certain securities offered to state investors. And in terms of examining, we would examine brokerage and investment advisor firms to ensure compliance with securities law and maintenance of accurate records and client accounts. So next, in terms of investigations, state securities regulators often initiate investigations because of complaints from investors who believe that they've been wrong done by a professional who's either in the securities industry or who may purport or claim to be a part of the securities industry. We would generally investigate investor complaints and potential cases of investment fraud. So perhaps you'd know them more by, affinity fraud, or lottery and sweepstakes frauds, or Nigerian prince scams, internet frauds, or Ponzi schemes. I'm not going to get too much into detail about what these are because Kristen's going to do that in a little bit of a later slide. In terms of complaints, the NASAA 2019 enforcement report, which would be based on 2018 data, indicates that there were actually 8,814 complaints received through NASAA's US membership, so through the states. And of those complaints, 5,320 investigations were initiated. And so I know there's a discrepancy between complaints and investigations, and that really reflects the extensive efforts to informally resolve complaints too, which is why not every complaint is investigated. Obviously, they're informally resolved. I should note, though, that these are not just older investor complaints I'm talking about, but they would be all investor complaints. We also protect investors by enforcing state securities laws, and we do this through a number of ways. We do this through compliance reviews, and then by fining perhaps or penalizing, providing restitution to investors, prosecuting white-collar criminals, and imposing legally binding conduct remedies designed to correct specific problems. So again, if we look to the NASAA 2019 enforcement report, it was reported that 558 million was ordered returned to investors in US member jurisdictions alone, and 490 million was assessed in fines and penalties. In terms of criminal relief, there was 1,048 years of incarceration ordered and 705 years of probation. So in terms of educating, so many individuals in our older population may be vulnerable due to social isolation and distance from family and other support networks. And NASAA members are keenly aware of this concern. And really, we try to interact with our older investors on a regular basis through investor education events or in response to investors' questions to educate investors on schemes that are circulating, current schemes that might be targeting older adults, and certain manipulative practices that we're seeing. And educating investors about their rights and providing tools and knowledge that they may need to make informed financial decisions is incredibly important. And it's perhaps even more so when it comes to older adults. When you consider that this cohort may not have the time to really rebuild the losses that might be experienced after a case of financial exploitation. We truly believe that education can be the best protection for financial exploitation and abuse. In many cases, such as the cases we see where a scammer may move money offshore, once the money has been taken by the scammer and it's moved, it's gone, and there's really no way of making that victim whole again. But education for us, I'd say, it doesn't really stop at the investors. Financial abuse is really a concern for everyone, and we really believe that you need to take a holistic approach to battling financial exploitation. And so we also aim to educate industry and family and caregivers as well. At NASAA, we recognize that educating industry was a key to combating financial exploitation, and we launched what's become to be known as Senior Safe Training. So Senior Safe Training was it was training that was created and actually originated out of our main state securities regulator. And it was for use by banks and credit unions initially, used to increase identification and reporting of suspected cases of elder financial abuse. And so in Maine, we collaborated with the State Securities Administrator in Maine and the Maine Council for Elder Abuse Prevention to retool this Senior Safe Toolkit so that it could be available for our broker-dealers and our investment advisors, teaching broker-dealers and investment advisors, about the signs of abuse or why you should report financial abuse and who to report it to. And so this Senior Safe program has been quite useful and has been quite successful. And I would say that one of the reasons it's been so successful, and perhaps the key to the success of the program, has been really the strong working relationships that have been built through the program with adult protective services agencies and other community-based resources. So the Senior Safe program really takes the approach of, there's no wrong door approach, or there's no wrong door to report to. And so no matter what agency a report goes to, there's a commitment by all of the agencies working together that they'll make sure that the report gets to the right person. So they don't turn the person away and say, this report's not for us, it doesn't involve us. They make a concerted effort to reach out to the other agencies to ensure that the older person is taken care of. So lastly, in what we do as state securities regulators, we advocate. So we advocate for passage of strong, sensible, and consistent state securities laws and regulations. And part of what we're going to talk about today is how we put together a group at NASAA to address older and vulnerable investors' needs and the passage of strong state laws in the form of our Model Act to protect vulnerable adults from financial exploitation, and how we did this in an effort to protect senior investors. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Kristen.
Great, thanks, Deb. Next slide. So the next couple of slides we're going to show you address the top schemes securities regulators are seeing. And you're probably familiar with some of these schemes. You've probably seen them in the work that you do. I'm not going to go through each one of them in great detail, but I want to focus on the few that you may not be as familiar with. And the first one is unregistered securities. In the United States, all securities that are offered and sold must be registered or exempt from registration. And a security that is registered has to comply with many regulatory requirements. If a security is, one of the things that a person can do to protect themselves in this type of scheme is to check whether the security is registered with their state securities regulator or the Securities and Exchange Commission. A common scheme involving unregistered securities is a Ponzi scheme, and Deborah mentioned that just a moment ago. A Ponzi scheme is where there's no underlying business to support the payments that are being made to investors. So as investor money comes in, it's just going out the door to pay other investors the interest that they were promised. Another point that I want to hit on in regards to unregistered securities is that the definition of a security is very broad. Anytime a person gives another person money with the expectation that they will receive that money back plus something extra, it could be a security. So it's everything that's commonly thought of as a security, such as stocks or bonds or other things that are traded on exchanges. But another example is a promissory note. And even as the Supreme Court decided in one case, if you give someone money for a citrus grove with the expectation that you will receive profits from the sales of that citrus, then it can be a security. The takeaway here is that when you're thinking of issues that you can work with your state securities regulator on, think broadly, because it may include more than what you think of at first glance. The second scheme that we see is affinity fraud. And affinity fraud is where people are targeted based on a common characteristic. So they could be members of the same religious group or social or fraternal organization. The next, variable and equity indexed security. So these are legitimate products that are suited for a specific type of person. There is an incentive for salespeople to sell these products because they receive a high commission. They're insurance products, and there's a lot of fees that go along with them. So when the problem with these types of products is that when they're sold to somebody who's not suited for the product, and that person needs to sell or get out of the investment, there's typically high fees or surrender periods in which the money is locked up. So for seniors who may be on a fixed income, it's really tricky for them to invest in a variable annuity or an equity indexed annuity because they may not have access to their money if something, if a health issue comes up or an unexpected expense. The next thing that we see are viaticals and life settlements. So when I give my live presentations, I like to ask for a show of hands of those who've heard of viaticals or life settlements. And typically there aren't many hands raised. A viatical and life settlement, there are life insurance policies where the policyholder sells the policy to a third party for an amount that's higher than the surrender benefit or surrender value, but lower than the death benefit. And typically the policyholder that's selling their insurance policy has a terminal illness and is expected to pass away in a short time period. However, as we saw during the 90s AIDS crisis, due to advances in healthcare, that's not always the case. People are living longer, and so even when somebody has a terminal illness, they may survive for a longer period of time than what is expected. And then lastly on this slide, I'm sure you've seen these types of scams, the internet romance scams or lottery and sweepstakes, Nigerian prince scams, or identity theft. One thing that I like to point out here is that while seniors are targeted for these types of scams, they're not the only ones targeted, nor are they the only ones who fall for them. I was, I had this circumstance where I was in the car driving with a friend of mine. She's also an attorney, and she also she prosecutes fraud for a living. And we were having a conversation. I noticed she pulled out her phone, and then she pulled out her wallet and started texting somebody something. So I asked her, "What are you doing?" And her response to me was, "Oh, don't worry about it. My bank texted me and said that there might have been a breach to my account, and I just need to text them back my account number so they can verify whether I was a part of the breach." Well, while she was saying it, she realized this is a scam. But it took her a second. It took her saying it out loud in order to realize that. And this is a sophisticated person that just was caught in a moment of vulnerability. And the takeaway here is that anyone can be a victim of a scam, and there's no shame when you are a victim of a scam in coming forward and stopping the harm from occurring to somebody else. Next slide, please. Anytime there's something going on in the world, scams will pop up that tailor themselves to capitalize on what's going on. So NASA recently formed a project group to identify and stop schemes related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The scams listed here you may recognize as their variant of scams that pop up from time to time. And the first is when a company claims to be working on or have developed a cure or treatment. This is a common scam that will pop up depending on what's going on at the time. The second is fraud related to government programs provided under the CARES Act. So here, a company would offer to help a person obtain money under the CARES Act grant. However, the catch is that the person must pay a fee first before they can receive the money under the grant. And of course, the person never receives the money from the CARES Act. The third type of scheme that we see is really preying on people's fear of the unknown. So this is a promise. The scheme promises safe investments tied to commodities. Sometimes it's gold or silver. It could be other commodities as well. And lastly, charitable investment schemes prey on a person's good nature to give to a worthy cause. The best way to protect oneself from a charitable investment scam is to verify that the charity is legitimate before giving the money. It's kind of tricky sometimes though, because scam organizations may choose a name that is very similar to a legitimate organization. But many states require charitable organizations to register, and in Washington State, they register with our Secretary of State's office. If you have a question as to whether a charity is legitimate, you should check with your state's office to verify whether or not they're registered. Next slide, please. Deborah gave you a little bit of a background already of NASA and state securities regulators. And for context of this slide, I want you to think of state regulators as mini securities and exchange commissions that are located in each state with jurisdiction over that state. I'm actually going to address the information on this slide backwards because studies have found that one of the most important ways to combat fraud is by educating people about the fraud. So state securities regulators educate investors on common scams. Personally, I travel around Washington State giving presentations to senior related organizations, APS units, area agencies on aging, and other groups. As they invite me in, I will travel to them, at least pre-pandemic, travel to them and give a presentation without charge on the common scams that we see. Second, we partner with industry professionals to develop tools related to recognizing financial exploitation and cognitive impairment. This really is a two-way relationship. We will provide the information to the industry that we have, but we also seek information out from them as well as what they're seeing so that we can inform the rest of the industry on that. And third, many state securities regulators have the authority to take administrative action to stop the exploitation. An administrative action is typically a fine or a penalty or a revocation of a license. When we don't have jurisdiction, or where we share jurisdiction with another agency or organization, as Deb mentioned before, we make referrals to them or we will work alongside of them. In Washington State, we have attorneys and financial analysts on staff that can help APS or prosecutors build securities fraud cases or financial exploitation cases. We also have a dedicated prosecution fund, which reimburses prosecutors who will criminally prosecute our cases. So we really try to team up with other agencies and organizations to fight the fraud, securities fraud. Please advance to the next slide. So the committee that Deb and I lead, the NASAA Senior Issues and Diminished Capacity Committee, tackles issues related to senior investors, regulators, and industry professionals. We've drafted a model act, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the following slide. We also engage with shareholders and develop other resources. All under the umbrella of senior financial exploitation, we've worked on a diverse array of issues, such as building a multi-jurisdictional task force. If we have a toolkit, so if you're in an area that does not have a multi-jurisdictional task force and you're interested in forming one, we have tools that could help with that, that are available. We've worked on vicarious trauma. We hope to release something related to that soon. We've looked at how opioid use affects or opioid abuse of a family member impacts senior investors. And we've also looked at the impact of diminished capacity of a securities professional. And we will be releasing a report on our findings on that topic shortly. Next slide, please. Ooh, one moment. NASAA drafted a model act to prevent the financial exploitation of seniors. And I'm going to cover a few of the key provisions in the next couple of slides. First, I wanted to state, though, that the act is meant to protect individuals 65 and older and those who are subject to the state's APS statute. And then next, it requires securities industry professionals, which that includes investment advisors, broker-dealers, and their representatives, to notify securities regulators and APS when they reasonably believe that financial exploitation is or may have occurred in a securities-related account. So that would include an account that you have with a financial planner, a stockbroker, or any other investment professional. Some states have adopted variations of the Model Act, which are more broad, so they might include banks and credit unions as well. Next slide, please. The key provisions of our act include that investment advisors and broker-dealers are mandated reporters to state securities regulators and APS. Secondly, broker-dealers and investment advisors are permissive reporters to designated third-party contacts. They do not have to report to third-party contact if they suspect that that person is exploiting the victim or is a suspected perpetrator. And importantly, it provides broker-dealers and investment advisors the ability to delay disbursements from accounts, and it provides immunity for providing documents evidencing the fraud to law enforcement and APS. Next slide, please. So we want to survey the audience today to see how many of you are in a state that has enacted the state or the NASAA Model Act. Your options for the questions are yes, sure, yes, no, and not sure. And I just want to mention there's no shame in answering not sure.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and launch that. So you should see the poll on your screen, and you can vote or answer by clicking the white dot next to each answer option. And I'll leave this open for about another 30 seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and share the results. So we had 12% yes, 5% no, and 83% not sure.
Wow. Great, thank you. It looks like quite a number of you are not sure. The Model Act has been enacted in 27 jurisdictions. If we can turn to the next slide, those are listed there. So the states are listed at the bottom of the slide. In addition, several other states have enacted laws similar to the NASAA Model Act, like Washington State, where I am, and Missouri. So I'm going to turn back to Deb now.
Perfect, thank you, Kristen. So if we could just advance the slide, please. Perfect. So what else does our committee do then? So in terms of engagement, our committee does various types of engagement. And I would say that the first type of engagement we do is with our advisory council, who we really consider so very crucial for the work that the committee itself does. So our advisory council includes experts from different organizations, as noted on the screen, and we would have representation on our advisory council from many different organizations, such as the American Bar Association's Commission on Law and Aging, the Financial Planning Association, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Office of Older Americans, ARP, and actually we have representation from NAPSA as well, your very own Lori Delagrammaticus. And we thank Lori and NAPSA for its involvement that we have on the advisory council. Really, at NASAA, when we put our committee together, we felt that the committee work would be much better informed with the help of these experts. We may be experts in securities, but there's so many other areas that we really need to be informed on when serving older and vulnerable adults. And it's really through these experts that we often hear about new trends, issues and research that we should be following up on, and it really goes to inform our work throughout the year. And so one of these examples is an example that Kristen referenced earlier, and it's the issue of opioid use disorder. So it really wasn't until an advisory council and committee meeting a couple of years ago that the conversation of opioid use disorder came up. And we were having the conversation with one of the academics on the council when we realized that an increase in opioid use disorder across North America was negatively affecting seniors and was becoming an increasing driver of financial abuse of older Americans. It was also at that time that we had been hearing stories, particularly from one of the members on our group. She had been dealing with a heartbreaking story of having to deal with a senior who came to the state regulator for assistance after she had cashed in all of her savings to pay for what she thought was going to be her son's rehab. And in actual fact, he had just taken the money to fund his drug addiction and then actually came back and began taking advantage of her, had moved back into the home with her and began to steal from her further. So having been shown that this area was problematic and hearing from people on our committee that was problematic, we decided to do some research and see how we could address opioid use disorder in a securities context. We published resources that aimed to raise awareness of the impact of the public health crisis in opioids on our industry and on industry clients, and particularly seniors. We developed a guide for advisors which aimed to explain how opioid use disorder could impact clients, how to identify possible client exploitation driven by opioid use, and we also provided information on helping affected clients. So a checklist of perhaps questions to have with the client and some conversation starters on how to get that awkward conversation started. You know, it's really awkward to have a conversation about money to begin with. When you're pairing it with a conversation about opioid use disorder, it becomes even more difficult. And so we started conversation starters to really help advisors navigate those conversations. Another issue that was raised at one of our meetings with the advisory council and our committee was also inconsistency of information provided when reporting financial exploitation of seniors. And so the committee established a reporting toolkit designed to bring uniformity to the reporting process. We felt that this could be really beneficial, not just for state regulators, but really for state APS as well. The toolkit includes a reporting form that can be customized by state and really outlines what we felt the pertinent information you would need to include to make an effective report would be. It also includes a spreadsheet template to capture data to be used internally and for requests from state legislature and media, and also an outreach template for states that have recently enacted our Model Act. So perhaps template news releases to announce the passage of the new Model Act and the obligations such as reporting to APS under the new Model Act if the state were to adopt it. We could advance to the next slide, please. So we realized that we really benefited when other groups and experts gave us information and shared with us their expertise. And likewise, we realized that perhaps we had some expertise and we could bring a lot of value from a NASAA perspective to other people that were also doing other outreach to seniors. And so we've often offered our input in providing comments to publications or on collaborating with other organizations on publications they might be doing where we think we can be of value. I'd say that this webinar today is exactly that. We felt that it would be a really good pairing to come together with NAPSA, so NASAA members could learn more about NAPSA, NAPSA members could learn more about NASAA members, and we really could forge that relationship. We want to see these organizations, you know, not acting in silos, but acting together in a more holistic approach. I'd say that two of our more recent examples that I can think of our committee in particular engaging with outside organizations would be engagement that we had done with FINRA and with the SEC. And so FINRA earlier this year sought comments on a regulatory notice. It would have been this past November on a rule that they were proposing. And the rule was to limit a registered person from being named a customer's beneficiary or holding a position of trust. So it would have limited their ability to act in a power of attorney role or perhaps as a trustee role. And the rule was going to allow a registered person to be named a beneficiary if that person, if the customer was an immediate family member or where the registered person's firm approved it. So it could be an immediate family member, or if it wasn't an immediate family member, the firm would have to approve it. So at NASAA, we took the position and we provided comment on this proposed rule. And we took the position that really anybody but an immediate family member should really be prohibited from being named a beneficiary or being allowed to act in one of these roles as a power of attorney or a trustee. And we said, even if you do allow a family member to act in these roles, the registered person should be required to seek written approval from the member firm, so the member firm knows that they're acting in this role. And also the member firm should go one step further and should be required to implement heightened supervision of all of the accounts. And so we found that we were in a really good position to give this particular input, given some of our committee members' experience in this field, unfortunately. And I can think of one case particularly out of Maine, and a committee member on our committee member previously was from Maine. And there was a case of a gentleman who's now since been sentenced and found guilty. And he was a broker-dealer and actually a former Maine state legislator who was convicted of theft, securities fraud, income tax evasion, and a whole host of other crimes, when he ended up defrauding 2 elderly ladies and a war veteran through his abuse of power of attorney and trustee of 2 trusts. And his abuse is really insidious. I mean, he inserted himself in their lives and really made them trust him 100%. In the end, he stole close to $3 million, I believe, and he got 22 years and was ordered to pay close to $3 million in restitution. We also have teamed up with other organizations like the SEC and FINRA, and we did so more recently in the past year to issue what was known as the Senior Safe Act fact sheet to help promote greater reporting of financial exploitation. And so the Senior Safe Act is a federal act which became federal law in May of 2018. And the act doesn't mandate any action by financial institutions, but it does allow eligible employees at these institutions who satisfy requirements, and mainly its training requirements, to report, and in return for reporting, they're provided immunity for liability of any civil or administrative proceeding for reporting potential exploitation of a senior citizen. So as an example, this immunity can be very helpful when a firm wants to report potential exploitation, but really has a fear that the report could violate their privacy requirements. And so the jointly issued fact sheet provides general information about the Senior Safe Act, with the goal of really educating financial institutions and employees at those institutions about the benefits of the act in an effort to really promote them to report these potential abuses. And on to our next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our NASAA resources ourselves. So we have created a site very specifically focused around seniors' issues and needs. So it's serveurseniors.org. And under it, you'll find a lot of information for industry, for caregivers, and for investors. So for industry, you'll really find some of the resources that I've already spoken about. So you'll find our NASAA Model Act, and you'll also find an annotated Model Act, which is updated yearly. And so this year to year includes what states have adopted it throughout the year and any changes that might occur that might affect the application of the Act. There's the Senior Safe Fact Sheet that I previously mentioned, and a NASAA guide for developing practices and procedures for protecting senior investors and vulnerable adults from financial exploitation. You can also find under this link, under the industry link on this website, any link to any of the NASAA comment letters that we would have put in that affect seniors at all, or any that may touch on any seniors issues, and those are also listed under the industry site. Under the caregiver portion of this website, we also have listed state and provincial caregiver resources and provide directories to those resources. Then we provide other resources such as ARP caregiver resources, resources from the Alzheimer's Association. The website also features an interactive map of North America with contact information for local APS. And we're always looking to add more to this as well, more to the website. So if you see something that you think is particularly relevant that we should have in this caregiver portion of the website, and it's not already up there, Kristen and I would invite you to send it along to us so we can take a look at it and review it. And lastly, we have investor resources on this website. So we have publications like Be an Informed Investor or How to Protect Your Nest Egg. We have publications that talk about investigating before you invest, and also warning signs of guardian financial abuse, and that's just to name a few. Okay, and on to our last slide. So I'm going to leave some time for questions, so I won't go into every single publication on this last slide, but I will point everybody to the publication, which is the third publication down, the Senior Financial Exploitation Toolkit. And so the Senior Financial Exploitation Toolkit was something that we created to assist NASAA members in creating stronger multidisciplinary approaches to financial exploitation of older and vulnerable adults. And we wanted to do a few things with this toolkit. We wanted to enable our members to train agencies and partners in areas of senior financial victimization that they would not be familiar with. We wanted to increase and improve communication among partners in the state, and we wanted to organize joint campaigns to address older adult victimization. And so in this toolkit, you'll find resources like potential partner lists. So if a state didn't already have a multidisciplinary, group started in their state to combat financial exploitation of seniors, then they could go to the potential partner list, which would tell them all the people that they might want to reach out to. And those would be, local NAPSA members, ARP, local agencies on aging, the Department of Health, domestic violence centers. We also have a template PowerPoint that can be customized by our state regulators to share with these partners, which really details the prevalence of elder financial abuse, the signs of abuse, and how state regulators can really help in this area. Again, we really think a holistic approach needs to be taken to battle financial abuse, and we really hope this toolkit will help, again, get people out of these silos. And then one last point that I'll make, and Kristen mentioned this earlier, and I'm going to put a plug in for this, and Kristen is actually leading the effort and the charge on this project, is the report examining issues related to financial professionals with diminished capacity. So we're going to be releasing that soon. They've had lots of discussions with industry members and other regulators who clearly indicate that firms are encountering financial professionals with diminished capacity or cognitive issues that stem from a variety of factors. It could be perhaps an aging workforce. And so the report's really going to summarize how firms are managing these situations. And so we're going to hope it's going to be released very soon, and you should see that on our website. And so that's all we have here today. We're open to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. We do not have any questions sitting in the box at this point, but for attendees, if you all do have questions related to today's content, please feel free to write into that questions box. It is in the control panel that should have popped up when you logged into the webinar software. So I'll wait on the line for maybe another minute or so. Is that all right with you all, Deborah and Kristen?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, great. So we'll wait about another minute for questions to come in and see where we're at. And we did have a piece of feedback come in that said, thank you so much for such great information.
Yeah, and again, thank you for having us here today, because I really think that, I think our NASAA members benefited greatly yesterday. When we did the poll at the beginning of the session yesterday, 25% of people said they had worked with local APS. And we'd really like to see that number rise, and we'd like to see both NAPSA and NASA members really comfortable in interacting with one another. And I really think that these webinars go a long way to kind of opening each other's eyes to what we each do and how we can be a benefit to each other.
Yeah, absolutely. We did have a question come in. So the question was requesting that if you have some to share examples of partnerships or success stories within those partnerships.
Yeah, so this is Kristen. In one circumstance, I had a social worker call me. It was somebody that I had worked with when I was at the AG's office, and he called and said, you know, I have this individual, he doesn't qualify as a vulnerable adult under our, you know, under Washington state statute, but he has self-reported that he was a victim of a fraud. I was hoping that you could go out and talk to him. So I took a financial analyst to his house. We drove out there, we met him in person, and we sat at his kitchen table, and we interviewed the investor. And throughout the interview, the investor or the individual had a lot of trouble remembering details. He told a lot of stories repeatedly. We would ask him a question and he would answer with information that wasn't relevant, really showing signs that maybe there was some cognitive impairment with him at that time. But I asked him, you know, I asked if I could see the copy of the check. He said it was about a $300 check. So I asked him for a copy of the check that he sent. And he said he didn't have it, but he handed me his checkbook and said, well, could you look through it for me and find the check, which I don't recommend of people doing, but in this case, it was fine because I was there for a helpful reason. But when I looked through his checkbook, I found a check for $40,000. I didn't find the check for $300. And I asked him, well, what is this check for $40,000? And he said, well, don't worry about that. I just bought into an internet business. You don't have to worry about that. So I noticed that the check was written the day before, or 2 days before. And I asked him what he had done with the check, and he said he overnighted it to the company. I persuaded the individual to get on the phone and cancel the check. And, you know, I told him that if this is a legitimate opportunity, it will be available for you in the future, but we just need to do a little bit more research on it before we decide, you know, whether it's legitimate or not. He provided the documentation related to this investment, this $40,000 investment, and the documentation was one piece of paper with many misspellings on it. So all the red flags of fraud. It was copied in sort of that blue purple copy from like the, I don't know, was it the 80s? The copy machines would use that kind of blue purplish ink. So anyways, we stopped payment on the check, and I, you know, brought the check back to the office, or I brought the information back to the office. We ended up, Washington State Securities Division ended up working with the postal inspector, and it was a fraud, international fraud that was going on. The postal inspector was able to help investigate it and prosecute it. And in this instance, the investor didn't lose money because we were able to stop the check, but it was a great result because of the other, it uncovered an international scheme that many other victims were a part of. And it all started by a referral from an APS social worker saying it's only a $300 issue, but he really needs some help. Will you go talk to him?
And Kristen, I have an example, and it's actually not my example, but it is an example that I've heard from another state regulator in the past. And this is kind of a referral that went the other way. So an advisor was meeting with a client, and they knew something was off, and the client just did not seem themselves, and perhaps were slurring a little bit, and had been accompanied in by somebody new who didn't actually come into the meeting but had driven them there. And so they just really felt like something was off, and so they immediately reported to APS. And it turned out that a family member, so I don't know if it was, I can't remember now if it was, a nephew or a cousin, 5 times removed, but it was a younger family member, an adult, moved in with this older adult and had actually began giving inappropriate medication. And in fact, had APS not intervened and actually taken this man to the hospital, it could have been a very grave situation pretty quickly. So, and this person was being financially exploited as well, they came to find out.
I have other examples where, less dollar amount involved, no international schemes, but where APS social workers have referred issues over to my agency because in addition to securities regulation, my agency also regulates mortgage brokers, payday lenders, escrow agents, and similar financial service providers. And there have been several circumstances where an individual, a victim, is struggling with one of these service providers, and through a few calls, we're able to get the situation straightened out. It doesn't necessarily entail any enforcement action. It's just the fact that the victim wasn't able to communicate with the entities in the ways that they needed to communicate in order to facilitate, to get the transaction reimbursed the way that they needed to. And when we stepped in, we were able to assist with that. We have situations where APS has cases involving a lot of bank records, and we've done a team approach where under our statute, a lot of times APS can go to a bank without subpoenaing them and ask for the records. So APS we have the authority to get the records as well through a subpoena. But if APS gets the records and then we use our financial analysts to analyze those records and really put it together in a way so that they could either substantiate the case as being exploitation or refer it or do something else on the case.
Wonderful, thank you so much. It doesn't look like we have any other questions at this time, so I will wrap things up for today. Thank you all again for attending and listening, learning with me. And thank you, Kristen and Deborah, so much for sharing your time and expertise today. It's been really great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.